Welcome to the Behind the Bar. It is July 1st, 2025. I'm joined by Derek and Kirsten Brown Neal, our favorite guest and a sex crimes prosecutor here in LA County, who can really give us some insight into what all is happening. A huge day. The jury has reached a verdict on 4 of 5 counts, Derek.
4 out of 5 counts. They have reached a verdict. My heart is pounding like a jackhammer. Jason, where's your excitement? We don't have days like this in our newsroom very often. There is a lot of excitement and buzz. I mean, there's just a lot of activity. What happened was the jury came back with another note. They've been a very active jury, sending notes to the judge, asking questions for clarification, asking for testimony to be sent back to them. They came back with this note, and late this afternoon, the jury said, we have reached a verdict on counts 2, 3, 4, and 5, but some jurors, they did use the word jurors, plural, remain deadlocked on count 1, racketeering conspiracy. So that means 2, 3, 4, and 5 are 1 count of sex trafficking with respect to Cassie and 1 Mann Act count with respect to Cassie, and 1 sex trafficking count with respect to Jane, and 1 Mann Act count with respect to Jane. They say they've got a verdict on those. They don't say which way it is, but at this point, we can sort of prognosticate. We've got a prosecutor here with us. They were also instructed to continue deliberating. There was some back and forth about whether they could just give the verdict that they have on those 4 counts, or whether the judge would say, no, I don't want a partial verdict. You go back and deliberate. The judge heard from prosecutors and defense counsel, said, I received your note that you have reached verdicts on 2 through 5, but not on count 1. I ask at this time that you keep deliberating. They then went back, rather than deliberate much further, because it's 5 p.m. on the East Coast, they said, we're going to stop deliberating. We'll come back at 9 a.m. and get back at it on count 1. Kirsten, our question for you is, what do you make of all this? This is extremely sort of exciting stuff. There's no verdict, but there are some verdicts. What do you think of it?
So many thoughts. First of all, I'm not surprised the judge sent them back for further deliberations, probably giving them what we call in California the dynamite instruction. There's no chance he's going to take a partial verdict after only, a day and a half or so of deliberations. So that came as no surprise. Now, based on the question yesterday about drug distribution, if you look at the verdict form, that's the last predicate act on the verdict form. And the way the verdict form reads is you have to find guilty or not guilty, but if you find guilty on the racketeering conspiracy, then the jury needed to go through each of the predicate acts and determine if they were proved or not proved. My, again, bald speculation thought was you don't get to deciding whether or not a predicate act has been proven or not proved if you haven't decided guilty on RICO. So yesterday I was like, wow, I wonder if they've decided, guilty on RICO. But today to learn that they've got verdicts on 4, but are deadlocked on RICO has switched my thinking. And it's hard to imagine that they acquitted on, these aren't lesser included offenses, but they're not as serious. And it's hard to imagine they would have acquitted on those counts, and then they're still deliberating and possibly thinking about convicting on the RICO.
Derek and I had the exact same thought. It's hard to imagine that they said he did not transport sex workers across state lines for purposes of the Mann Act, did not commit sex trafficking with regard to either Jane or Cassie, but we're still going to consider RICO. It's theoretically possible because there are other predicate acts.
Right, it's possible,
but it seems counterintuitive.
It does.
But interestingly, getting read back for Cassie but not Jane has me thinking that Jane might be not guilty and they convicted on the Cassie counts.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to imagine, just given how the testimony played out, that they were like, yes, we're good on Jane.
Derek,
guilty, you don't need to hear anything.
Derek, talk about that for a second.
About Cassie.
Kirsten just mentioned read back. So when the jurors asked for testimony, it was all about Jane.
It was all about Cassie,
right?
So they asked for 3 separate incidents that were discussed during the testimony. One incident was the Intercontinental Hotel. We know all about
the beating
that.
Video.
Diddy's contention on that has always been they were having a fight about a cell phone, not about forcing her to remain at a freak off. So they wanted to see. It sounds like the dynamic was a juror said, I don't believe maybe that it's all been forceful. Show me elements of force or coercion. And so they brought up these 3 incidents. The Intercontinental Hotel is one of them. The second was the Cannes flight, the flight from Cannes, where there was this incident that was testified about where Diddy showed a sex tape or a freak off to Cassie on the flight and said he threatened to reveal that to her parents. And then obviously the video would go public. And then following that threat, forced a freak off. So that would be a nexus between a threat and her not wanting to participate in a freak off and doing so because she was threatened. That's the second element. And then they also asked for testimony from this sex worker named Daniel, who says he participated in a freak off. And during it, Diddy and Cassie went to another room. He says he overheard.
Well,
Diddy
first he saw her
beating
dragging her by the hair
Yes.
into the other room, and then heard what sounded like him beating her. So
and
here's,
then came
yeah,
out and
then
said, continue the freak off.
Right. So, Kirsten, to your point, but there was no such readback for any of the testimony about Jane. So you're
Right.
thinking, reading tea leaves here, which is all we're doing, that makes it look like they may have found guilt for Cassie, the Cassie-related offenses, and maybe not for the Jane-related offenses.
That's my thought. I think the consensus, and we all haven't spoke about it, but Jane's testimony was not as powerful as Cassie's was. And the cross-examination of her was a little bit more damning than it was with Cassie. So if,
Is your
it's
thought because
really
it
hard
sounded
to imagine that they felt solid about Jane, unless it was to acquit him, but they want to read back about Cassie. Again, that's just speculation, but practically speaking, that's what makes sense.
Is your thought that the Jane testimony landed as more of a transactional relationship because of he pays for her rent and she seemed more enthusiastic, whereas the Cassie stuff seemed more, I don't know, sort of prototypical force, elements of force over the course of this relationship with the threats on the flight and the
Yes.
Intercontinental Hotel? It was just a little murkier maybe with Jane. I tend to agree with you.
Jane more transactional, and then too, the one incident of violence that she talked about, could be argued that it's mutual combat. Diddy took it way too far, but she started it by pushing him, and then he escalated that fight, with increased violence. But I could see a jury looking at that and saying it's just a little bit too messy and murky between the two of them.
Right.
And she was a little bit older than Cassie. So there's a lot of reasons why they might be looking at her through a different lens than they looked at 21-year-old Cassie.
I want to play devil's advocate for a second. Isn't it possible that the jury is looking to acquit on all four, the two-man act claims and the charges and the two sex trafficking charges, and it's just a couple of people who don't necessarily want to let him go free altogether? And the jury is not given instruction on how long you might serve for these various crimes. So they might think, look, this is sort of a catch-all that might actually punish him for the horrible physical, emotional, psychological abuse that he occasioned on these women. And so therefore, even though we don't think that the prosecution met the various elements of the crimes, we don't want to let him go scot-free. So we're going to hold him on this one charge. Isn't that possible?
It is possible. What Jason has said is certainly a narrative that you can spin. It seems exceedingly unlikely for this reason. I think the weakest charge they had was RICO. So it seems like that they could be hung up on whether the prosecutors overcharged by painting him as a kingpin, like a Tony Soprano type. But the stronger cases were the other cases. So it's hard to believe that if there was only one guilty, it would be RICO and then not guilty. It's easy to sort of see guilty on the sex trafficking and the Mann Act, but not guilty on RICO.
Let me just point one thing out. The jury did come back at some point yesterday and ask for the judge to let them know whether the simple distribution of narcotics from one person to another could constitute distribution of predicate act.
And the judge said yes.
So the jurors may have, in that moment, been looking, these holdout jurors on the RICO may have been looking for, look, we don't think that he necessarily sex trafficked her. We don't necessarily think that he engaged in the Mann Act crimes. But he did distribute drugs. We know that. Like, there's no real dispute. We know that. And I do believe in maybe the extortion, or I do believe in the arson
or the
claim,
witness tampering,
or
the bribery.
Or the bribery. And therefore, I think we have the two predicate acts. So even though I don't, hypothetical jurors, I don't think he engaged in the sex crimes, I do think maybe you have two other predicate acts that get me to actually being able to punish this guy who's clearly a monster.
What do you think, Kirsten?
That's a really good point, Jason. Two things regarding the jury thinking that RICO is lesser. If you recall, during closing arguments, Mark Agnifilo was actually admonished by the judge for how he was describing the RICO charge as the prosecution overcharging and it being too much and them charging him. And these weren't his exact words, but basically the highest count you can.
Yep, good
We're
point.
not talking about a murder. So the jury may have understood the more significant charge of all of them was RICO, if they clocked that. And it might have been brought to their attention even further by the curative instruction that the judge gave. Regarding the predicate acts and them not finding them on the sex count, What I think is going to be a huge challenge on RICO is the fact that there was a unanimity instruction. And that means that there needs to be a unanimous decision about what predicates were proven and not
Oh,
proven.
interesting.
And the
Not just
prosecution
the
was
whole
asking,
RICO. Each individual
right?
predicate act
And
has
that
to be
is
unanimous.
right. And the prosecution asked to not include that unanimity instruction. So that was a big win for the defense to have to get all 12 people on the same page to not only find him guilty, which is required, but for all of those predicates to have to be
Yeah,
unanimous.
But let me ask you,
right.
That's a
if we have
challenge.
that, this is what puzzles me. So there are 8 predicate acts, 2
Mhm.
of which are acts involving sex trafficking is 1, and acts involving transportation for purposes of prostitution is
If you
2.
convict counts
So
2 through 5,
yes,
How
you
do
can
you?
check the boxes
those are the
on
2 predicate
1.
acts,
Right.
and they
Yeah,
are necessarily unanimous because you've
right.
convicted on 2 through
And
5.
and
so
another one is drug distribution, which really isn't even in dispute, right?
That's right,
so
but
we
they don't
have
need it at that point.
No,
so,
I know,
so
but
maybe
they
someone's
have,
like handing out drugs to someone is not the same as buying and distributing. So maybe they
But the
don't
judge
buy the
cleared that
judge's
up for 'em, but
instruction, they
yeah,
nullify it
sure,
for whatever
sure.
reason. But you've got the 2.
Yeah.
This is why
You
I
know,
think
I'm
that
sorry.
the predicate acts, you're right, you only get to them if you've said guilty. So they're hung up on this ultimate question or something, right? Because like you have the predicate acts, which you only get to if guilty, but someone is just unwilling to say he's Tony Soprano. Like
Yeah.
it sounds to me like the dynamic in there is someone's like, I get it. You've got predicate acts. I get sex trafficking. He forced Cassie. He maybe even forced Jane. He definitely was a violent guy. He transported prostitutes, but I'm
Mhm.
just not there. Like I can
And that
see that
person would be
dynamic.
my husband who, we talk endlessly about this case. And he's one of those people who's like, hey, Diddy's trash. But Rico,
Yeah. Yeah.
like I just
Yeah.
just don't see I
Uh,
don't see how the prosecution closed the loop on that.
Your husband and our boss both think the same way.
Mm,
So if you're put us in the minds of the prosecutor. If you're a prosecution and let's say you get a guilty verdict on just the Cassie charges, the Mann Act with respect to Cassie and the sex trafficking, is that a win for the prosecution? He's going to do a decade and a half in prison, in federal prison for that, right? It's a minimum 15 years, I believe, on the sex trafficking, and it's up to 10 on the Mann Act. And so is that still a win for them? He's going to be an old man by the time he sees the light of day. Is that still a win, or is it important to prosecutors, especially in this high profile case, to get that RICO charge conviction?
I mean, a prosecutor never likes a split verdict.
Uh-huh.
You are charging everything that you believe you can prove, and the goal is to get convictions on all of the counts. Given how some cases play out, you understand how juries can come back split, or in some cases on lessers. I think given how high profile this case is, um, they're going for the RICO. And if it's a sort of a consolation prize, the other counts, and if he remains in custody and is off to federal prison. But for the storied SDNY, I think a conviction on count 1 and anything less than that is um
They're going to be upset.
and publicly probably not so, but behind closed doors, like they didn't assemble the team they did,
Yeah.
and put on and go and with a lot of scrutiny go after this celebrity mogul with the idea that we'll just try to get him on something. So behind closed doors, I think it'll be a disappointment, but publicly, I'm sure they'll say that they're pleased and the victims got justice and all of that.
Let me ask a quick follow-up to that. Let's say they get guilties on 2 through 5. They poll the jury on sort of what happened on RICO, and they learn that it was 11-1 or 10-2.
Yeah.
Do they go through the expense of trying him again on RICO to sort of set that precedent or to save face because they really
salve
wanted
their
to bag
wounds,
him
yeah.
and they really want to use RICO in this robust and expansive way? Or do you just say, Diddy's life is ruined? To Jason's point, his life is effectively ruined if he's convicted on
Right.
the other 4 counts. Where do you think that lands?
A lot will probably play out in the sentencing, but this and the split's going to be very important, and it's interesting, important that you bring that up, Jason. If it's 11-1 for guilt, and the idea is you kind of had this, one person who might have been an outlier not seeing the evidence the way you presented, that's a stronger case to go through this process again. but also, do they have cooperation from the victims again? Are they going to get all of these
Right.
people back in
Does
here and
Cassie
give
want to
the
go
same
through
type
that
of
again?
testimony?
Yeah, sure.
It
Yeah.
might be helpful to fashion a plea on it
Uh-huh.
where, Diddy and his team are feeling a little bit more humbled and more willing to accept a plea. And then likewise for the prosecution, if you're not getting a conviction, you have to reevaluate how you presented your case,
Yeah.
even if it hung 11-1 for guilt. You have to be introspective and think about how you could do things better if you were to do it again.
I love this stuff. The dynamics are fascinating,
Yeah.
and having you here
So
is
right.
awesome.
fascinating.
So we are expecting and hopeful that we'll have a resolution one way or the other tomorrow. Kirsten, if you can come back and join us, I'm actually going to be up in where you prosecute cases up in Lancaster this weekend for 3 days in beautiful Lancaster, California.
Gorgeous.
Sounds like a lovely 4th of July.
Lovely 4th of July. It's only going to be 101, I saw, which is
That's all.
fantastic.
That's not bad in July.
Anyway, but thank you so much for joining us and giving us your insight. We couldn't do it without you because Derek and I
My
don't know this
pleasure.
stuff.
I'd be happy to come back tomorrow, hopefully dissecting verdicts.
Yes,
Sounds great.
indeed. Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
Kirsten.
Kirsten.
Bye, guys.
All right, guys, we're going to stick around for a minute and do some of your comments and questions. We love having Kirsten around. I was jokingly, but she's
so good at
is
it.
so
She
good at it.
She knows it. She
And she's
tries
been through
cases.
this
This old
before,
bankruptcy
right.
lawyer, and this old civil litigator, we can only get you so far.
Right. All right, guys, do we have some comments and questions that have come through? Oh my God! Can you make it smaller, please? Oh, there we go. All right. So we're going to run through a few of these. We've answered them. Aaron Klein says, "What are the chances of he is not guilty?"
If I were a betting man, I would say there is next to zero chance that he walks completely. I don't know if Jason's going to want to take as bold of a stance, but I would say next to zero.
Yeah. Percentages? 5%?
Less.
Less than 5. I go with a solid 7.5%. So Brenda, you're asking the question. Derek just asked if Kirsten, if they reach a verdict for count 1 with a prosecution retry, it depends what the jury says. It depends if they can fashion I think that is true. They'll probably fashion a plea at that point.
I think that was a brilliant comment because everyone's chastened by a hung jury. Everyone has more risk. You don't want to assemble all those witnesses again. So you say, look, we want to extract our pound of flesh. You don't want to go through this again and face the risk of a guilty. So let's just reach a deal here.
Ms. Ray, I believe it is, RAII, is it 10 years each charge? Yes. Theoretically, it is 10 years each charge for the Mann Act, up to 10 years for the Mann Act, 15 minimum for each of the 15 to life for each of the 2 sex trafficking charges. Yes, they will all be theoretically they can be made consecutive, and he could serve the rest of his life and then some in prison. Dylan, why do we keep referencing Tony Soprano? That's on us. We do it all the time because it's something that we can relate to. We were both Sopranos people. Most of our audience can relate to.
That's the archetypal example of RICO. You think of RICO as organized crime. It's a statute to punish people who bend the law and break the law in order to run an enterprise. And you think of the mafia.
Yeah.
So I think of Tony Soprano. And trying to fit what Diddy did into that mold is, I think, the difficulty that the jurors are having on that charge.
Yeah, and then Nancy, this is a great question. A member of OJ's Dream Team said he predicts an appeal based on evidence that was prejudicial and irrelevant. Do you agree? This could actually be where the settlement is, right? Yes. I won't appeal all the underlying convictions if you do not re-prosecute me on RICO.
I think that's right. And all of those things are going to be on the table because the SDNY, if they don't get the conviction on RICO that they want, they will have lost some face. And so they may be willing to come to the table and say, all right, we'll bend a little bit on agreements as to how hard we go for sentencing.
I think it's sentencing. And also I think that they will come out and they will say, we're going to retry you at great personal expense. We're the government. We have untold wealth. I mean, he does.
Now,
too.
Diddy's threats are real to appeal this forever. He has a lot of wealth.
It is, but he's also going to be spending all that time in prison. I think he lacks some of the leverage that the prosecution has in that respect. But I do think that there's something if they're going to go to him and say, we want you to drop your appeals, he may refuse. I mean, if he really thinks he has a good case on appeal to overturn the 15-year sentences on sex trafficking, he might just do it.
It'll be interesting. Let's see what we put up a poll that said, what do you think the verdict will be? Which I always think is interesting because you guys are very educated on this case. You watch a lot of content. You're listening to us describe how things are going.
And also, just to build on that, you and I think maybe we get too mired, given that we're lawyers, too mired in sort of the legal nuance of it all. Whereas the jurors are not lawyers, and most of the folks listening are not lawyers, and they're probably going to come to a more reasoned decision that might be more in alignment with the jury,
with reality.
We are. Right,
yes, exactly. You're more like a jury than these two lawyers debating those issues. So you say 61% of you say guilty. We didn't get more granular guilty as to what, but 61% of people who have followed this case and followed our podcast think this guy's not walking out
And
free.
more to the point, yesterday, before this verdict, I believe it was 52-48 were said it was going to be guilty. So obviously it hasn't actually moved as far as I would think. I would think it would be up to 80% by now, given what we now know. But nevertheless, it has ticked up.
One thing I know for sure is it will be a sleepless night for Diddy in that cell block. This is very, very devastating news, I think, from his perspective.
All right, guys, we will see you tomorrow for sure.